Today's story is called The Tenants and the Vineyard. Now, this story is a story that Jesus told to help us to think about God's kingdom. So we know that one day God will make a new world and that we will live together with him there. And so Jesus was down on earth, so he was spending time down on earth, and Jesus was speaking to some religious leaders. So these were people that were in the temple with him. Now, the religious leaders didn't always like Jesus. They thought that Jesus was trying to be more important than them. And they felt that they understood God's word very, very well. And they wanted to be the people in charge of teaching all of the people. But Jesus was in the temple with them. And he was spending some time talking to the religious leaders because he wanted to help them to understand a bit more about God that they didn't know. So Jesus told them a parable, and a parable is a story. Jesus liked to tell stories because stories were things that people could remember a bit better. So if someone tells you a story, then you might remember it in your head, and then you might remember the special message that was in the story. So Jesus told the religious leaders a parable on this day. Now, this is what happened in the story. So let's pop our religious leaders over there for a minute, and Jesus can go up there. So one day there was a man, and he decided that he was going to plant a vineyard. So he planted a vineyard. Now, here's our vineyard. Vineyard is where grapes grow. So here's the vineyard that the man planted. And once he'd planted the vineyard, he actually made it nice and safe, and he built a wall around it. And he also built something called a watchtower, which was a tall building which we'd be able to look out of so he could see that the vineyard was nice and safe and being taken care of. Now, the man didn't want to stay in the vineyard. He decided that he would go and live in another country. So off he went to go and live in another country. And whilst he was gone, he trusted the vineyard to some tenants. So these are people that looked after the vineyard for him. So he still owned the vineyard. It still belonged to him, but these were the people that were looking after it. Now, the time came when there was lots of fruit in the vineyard that had ripened. And so the tenants were very pleased to see all this lovely fruit. Now remember, although the tenants could have some of the fruit, it still was something that belonged to the owner, even though he lived in a different country. And so the owner sent some servants of his to come and ask the tenants for his share of the harvest, which is when the fruit is ready. It's called a harvest, and you gather it all up, and then you've harvested your fruit and it's ready to be shared out and to eat. But the tenants decided that they didn't want to let the servant have any. They didn't want him to have a share of the harvest. And so they did some really mean things, and they actually beat them up. They either beat the servant up and left him, and he ran away and didn't come back. And when another servant came, they killed him. And so then he obviously couldn't have any of the harvest. And then another servant came, and they did the same thing again, because these tenants were actually beginning to show signs that they wanted to be in charge. They wanted to have all of the power. They didn't care about the owner and how he owned the vineyard. They wanted it all for themselves. They didn't want to make good choices. They didn't want to show love. They just wanted to do things their own way. They had ideas of how they wanted to run the vineyard, and it didn't include anybody coming to share any of the harvest and take it for the owner. Now, the owner knew that things were going wrong. He knew that the tenants were behaving badly and showing broken love. And so he had an idea. He thought, if I send my son, here's his son, to go to the vineyard and collect some of the fruit, then surely, because he's my son, they will show respect to him and they will give him my share. And so the son went to the vineyard and he asked the tenants for his share of the vineyard. But the tenants didn't see it that way. They saw the son and they thought to themselves, if we get rid of him, then we can have the vineyard and we can own it all ourselves. And so very sadly, the tenants did the same thing to the son. And they killed the son. And so he was no longer able to have a share of the vineyard. Now, the owner knew what had happened and he saw all of the broken love that had been happening. And actually, when he decided it was time, he actually came back to the vineyard. And when he came back to the vineyard, he had the power, because he owned the vineyard, it was lawfully his, he had the power to get rid of the tenants. And so the tenants had to go. And now the owner claimed back the vineyard. And everything was his again. And he could then choose who he wanted to give the vineyard to next. Next time, maybe he would have some new tenants that were ready to take care of the vineyard and to share the good things from the vineyard with him. Now, this story that Jesus told, really helps us to think about God and God's kingdom. Now, if you can just imagine for a minute that God was like the owner of the vineyard. God owns the vineyard, or God owns the world. So the whole of the world is owned by God. And if you can imagine that we are all of the people that live in the world, we are a bit like the tenants. And actually, God has trusted our world with us. He's trusted the world, he's given it to all of us, just the same way as the owner gave the vineyard to the tenants. God has trusted the world to us, and he wants us to show love in the world and to look after it. Now, there's another thing in this story that's a bit similar to our world, because God did the same thing as the owner. When the owner sent his son to come and live in the world and come back to the vineyard and ask the tenants for the vineyard, God sent Jesus into the world. That was his son. But actually, we can remember in the Easter story that there were people that were showing broken love. And actually, people were doing their own things and they were becoming people who didn't care, and they showed broken love instead of love in the world. And they actually wanted Jesus to be got rid of in the same way as the tenants got rid of the owner's son. And so this story helps us to think about the sort of people that are living in the world today. Are we going to be people like the tenants who are showing broken love? Or are we going to be people like the new tenants, who are the good tenants, who are going to show love in the world? Because one day God says that he will come back he will come back to this earth the same way as the owner came back to the vineyard. And God will be making choices. He will be looking to see who he wants to share his kingdom with in the same way as the owner was looking who he wanted to share his vineyard with. I wonder whether God will be looking for people in the world that are showing love to share his kingdom with. Or I wonder whether he'll be looking for people who are showing broken love to share his kingdom with. Now, it's really important that we have a little think about the things that we do in the world. We have had our world trusted to us by God, and he wants us to do our best to show love so that one day when he comes back to see us all on earth, he knows exactly who he wants to share his kingdom with.